Hello.
So tonight on our agenda of things to do, we're going to finish going over chapter 16's material, which has to do with Christian, Byzantine, and Gothic art. And then we're going to go over chapter 17, which primarily focuses on the Renaissance and ends with a little bit of information about the Baroque and Rococo period. So just like last week, we are going to have a bit of a long night with a lot of time covered, not as much as last week's time lapse, but still quite a bit of stuff that we're going to be covering. For those of you that have already completed your discussion posts, good job. Thank you for doing that. It also makes my life easier when you guys do things like early because I can get stuff out of the way. For those of you that have not done your individual discussion posts, we covered that material last week. So you're going to want to probably look back at that lesson and get that done because it's due Sunday, like our usual discussion posts. You guys also need to be working on your individual presentations as well. So you got a couple of things that you need to be doing. But any questions about discussion posts or individual presentations before we get the show on the road? If you do have a question later on, like after the session ends or sometime later on in the week, feel free to shoot me an email and I will get that answered right away. For anyone that does have class on campus, keep an eye out for a SHAP alert. It is not decided yet whether or not we're going to delay class tomorrow morning if you do have classes on campus. So keep your eye on an email for that in case it does happen. But I'm assuming probably most of you don't have classes on campus.
Hello.
Hey, Eric. So let's go ahead and get started. Like I said, we are going to start off this week where we left off last week with our Christian and Byzantine art. Trying to get my screen set up. So last week we finished off with ancient Greece and the Roman Empire. Originally, Rome was not accepting of Christianity. We mentioned that briefly when we were covering the Colosseum and the fact that they did crucify and burn Christians at the Colosseum's location. It's because originally Christianity was not accepted in the Roman Empire. It was illegal to be a Christian. Eventually, though, in year 313 CE or AD, whichever one you're wanting to use, Emperor Constantine, the Roman emperor at the time, legalized Christianity. The story goes that he was actually on his deathbed and he was worried that he was going to die and he didn't know what was going to happen to him. So he converted to Christianity on his deathbed and then miraculously he did not die. So he took that as a sign and he ended up putting crosses on all of the Roman armor and everything after that. So in 313 AD, or CE, Rome finally accepted Christianity, and this is going to end up changing how their art looks from then on out. Prior to the Christian faith being accepted in the Roman Empire, people had to worship in things called catacombs. Catacombs is where you bury dead people. So the Christians would secretly worship and have meetings in these catacombs where they buried the dead. And in these meeting places, they would decorate them with Christian iconography. So on the ceiling here, you can kind of make out Christ as the shepherd. There's Christ with some sheep around him. And here we have the 12 apostles. So this is just an example of what Christians were doing when Christianity was still illegal and how they were choosing to represent their faith and imagery. You'll notice that it's pretty flat and not super realistic looking in comparison to some of the, I'll refresh your brains, some of the artworks that we looked at last week from Rome, which are pretty realistic looking. Christian art is not that. And that continues on when Emperor Constantine, which that is his Colossus statue bust there, legalizes Christianity. You'll notice here in the colossal statue, he looks a bit cartoonish and his eyes are quite large. That's because this was actually like a gigantic statue of him and people had to look at him from down below. So it had to be really, really large. And that's why the eyes are a bit odd. You know what? I didn't start recording this, I don't think. Oops. Yeah, it serves them right. Okay, I did record it. I was going to say, I can't remember what I've done or not done so far today. So here's a close-up of that bust. So this is the guy that legalizes Christianity in Rome. This ends up leading to the spread of that particular religion throughout the Roman Empire. The particular law that legalizes Christianity is called the Edict of Milan. And eventually in 330 CE, that same emperor that legalizes it ends up deciding to move the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Byzantium, and he renames the city of Byzantium Constantinople. Byzantium, or Constantinople, is located in present-day Istanbul. Eventually, the Roman Empire, it gets too big, so they have to divide into two parts. They divide into an Eastern Roman Empire and a Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire ends up falling to barbarians or Germanic tribes in 476 CE, and the Eastern Orthodox Empire continues on until quite a lot later, until the Muslims take over parts of it. So we are going to be looking at art made in both the Eastern and the Western Empire. Eastern and Western Christian Empire differs quite a bit. Western Empire Christianity is based around Roman Catholicism. Of course, the original Roman Catholicism, which is a bit different from today's Roman Catholicism. And the Eastern Orthodox Empire has Eastern Orthodox Christianity. We'll talk about the differences of those when we get to looking at their artworks. Something else that happens in Christian era is that a lot of the town meeting halls from the Roman era end up being converted into churches. This is an early floor plan of what those Christian churches looked like. So they had a portico or an entrance with an atrium, which is kind of like a garden area. There was a well in the center for you to cleanse yourself. Then you would walk into the building. In the building, there was a central nave with aisles on each side, and then an apse at the front with an altar. So that looks like this in a more three-dimensional format. The reason why they had these side aisles was because a lot of people would come to visit these churches just to see relics. Relics are things that the churches would collect that used to be owned by or supposedly owned by important religious figures, such as like Mary's cloak. And they would put them on display in the churches, and they didn't want people disturbing the masses, so they had side aisles for the visitors to go down so they wouldn't disturb the people for mass. So we see a transition from Roman style to Christian or Byzantine style. They're known as interchangeably either or in the Church of Ravenna or the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna. We don't see frescoes like we did with Pompeii anymore, and they have switched instead to using mosaic tiles for wall decorations. Because they're using tiles instead of frescoes now, it's quite flat. It's a bit harder to get three-dimensionality with tiles than it is with painting on fresco. And with the wall mosaics and ceiling mosaics in the Church of San Vitale, we see a combination of religion and state. So we're going to see the emperor and empress, Justinian and Theodora, blended in with religious biblical figures. That's partially because it is their family church, the emperor and empress's family church. So it makes sense that they would be on the walls. But it's also a show of them being selected by God as the emperor and empress of Byzantine or Byzantium at the time. Byzantine art is quite well known for using a lot of decorative richness, such as the gold mosaics that we're about to look at, but it's also known for being quite flat. And here is the exterior of the Church of San Vitale. And here are some of the mosaics on the inside. So right here we see Empress Theodora, and she's surrounded by her court. If you notice, she has a halo behind her. Once again, that's to represent that she was supposedly selected by God to lead the people of the Western Roman Empire. So she is herself a religious figure, at least the way she's being depicted here. And here is an image on the opposite wall of her husband, Emperor Justinian, who also has a halo behind him. So I always love to point out the feet here. The feet are kind of like this. That's just to reiterate the flatness of these mosaics. These feet look like they're floating. This church is entirely covered with wall and ceiling mosaics. This is an image on the ceiling of Christ as Panto creator, or creator of all. And here's just to tell you the entire thing is covered in mosaics, floor to ceiling. So that was imagery from the Western Empire. The Western Empire, once again, had Roman Catholic influences. Next, we're going to take a quick look at the Eastern Empire. The Eastern Empire had Eastern Orthodox Christianity. This split happens in year 726 with Leo III. Leo III orders the destruction of all Christian images over in the Eastern Empire. And of course, the Roman Catholics don't think that you need to destroy imagery. Eastern Orthodox Christianity believes that if you are looking at images of biblical figures, that you're committing idolatry. That you shouldn't be looking at those images, you shouldn't own the images. It deters from the actual religious figure. Roman Catholicism doesn't believe that at all. Roman Catholics use a lot of imagery in their, throughout art history. They've used a ton of imagery in their art, the church settings. In fact, they're known later on during the Renaissance and Baroque period for using imagery to bring people to church. So quite a big difference there. So this is one of the rare images that we do have in the Eastern Orthodox faith region of the Roman Empire. This is another image of Christ as Pantocrator. This particular painting no longer exists, though. And like I said, Eastern Orthodox style did not usually allow imagery of biblical figures. It was closely supervised by their church. But we do have a few very small examples of artworks from the Eastern Orthodox early Christian faith. And the only other one that we're going to look at tonight is Andrei Rublev's Old Testament Trinity. Right here. So here we see three angels sitting around a table. This is an excerpt, or an illustration, I should say, of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. If you're familiar with that Bible story, God sent three angels to Sodom and Gomorrah to see if the cities are worth saving, and they discover that they are not. So this is an illustration of that particular story. Okay. It's not a good sign. Okay. I don't know if you guys see that or not, but okay. Moving on from Christian or early Christian art, we're going to go into the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages of Europe. So the Middle Ages are the period of time that begin at the fall of the Roman Empire and end with the Renaissance. They're called the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages because people completely move away from the Greek and Roman teachings. It's almost like they're completely forgotten. And then eventually during the Renaissance period, thanks to humanists and the printing press, all of those Greek and Roman philosophies and ideas come back. So, like I mentioned, the Western Roman Empire ends up falling to Germanic tribes or barbarians. And that marks the beginning of the, I do not know what's going on here. Y'all, my computer is doing some weird stuff right now. My team's just decided to do stuff on its own. Okay. I thought I lost you for a second. All right. So the Greeks and the Romans hated the barbarians. In fact, the Greeks hated anyone that was different from them. But the Romans were so afraid of the barbarians that they built Hadrian's Wall. And China hated the barbarians so much, or the Mongols. They're another example of barbarians. Literally, barbarians refer to anyone that don't speak Greek. So I wouldn't read too much into that. China's barbarians were the Mongols. The Western Greek barbarians were literally everyone. So the Chinese end up building the Great Wall of China to keep out their version of barbarians, the Mongols. The thing that keeps all of the barbarians classified as barbarians is the fact that they have absolutely no written language. An early example of barbarians, or what would be classified as a group of barbarians is the Vikings. A lot of what we know about the Vikings is because they would do burial ships. So when an important figure of the community passed away, they would put them on a ship and set the ship on fire with a bunch of precious possessions in it and watch it burn out on the water. And this is an example of a ship that they found that it did not completely burn. And inside of those ships, they find objects such as this. This is the Sutton Hoo purse cover. It's because of objects like this that we learn those early Vikings, barbarians, Germanic tribes were very talented metalsmiths. This is all inlaid metal with precious stones or semi-precious stones. And here is a belt buckle. Also metal work with inlaid stones. And some coins. And another belt buckle. Here you can really see what will later influence the Celts in their Celtic art. You see a lot of Celtic knots here. And all of those things are examples of what they would find on those burial ships. So eventually, Christianity will end up spreading to even those barbaric tribes that had no written language. And because of that, they end up adopting Christianity as well as their own forms of language that they write, which we see with the Book of Kells, which is an illustrated manuscript from Ireland, right here. And the Book of Kells is still located in Ireland. They have it in a really famous library there, and they'll change the page every day. So it's not the same page all of the time. Of course, you can't change the page because it's a very, very old book. But it's a pretty fun thing to look at. You might notice there's a person's head just hanging around here. There's a cat and a mouse somewhere on this page too. And here's another page from the Book of Kells. And this is a great illustration of the fact that they did eventually adopt their own form of written language. With the spread of Christianity comes the spread of Christian churches. The early churches are usually similar to that format that I showed you earlier with the apse and the nave. Later on, they adopt something called a Romanesque style. Romanesque just refers to them being similar to Roman architecture, so columns and arches. And churches end up becoming popular pilgrimage destinations. A pilgrimage is a journey that people go on to religious locations to see things like those relics. Because of these pilgrimages drawing in tourists, people had to build bigger churches than what they originally would do. So with the Middle Ages in Europe, we see a boom in large churches being built. Once again, Romanesque is Roman-like. It has a lot of arches, barrel vaults, columns. We see the reemergence of stone carvings, which we hadn't seen for quite some time. If you remember the Christian Byzantine, they would mostly do mosaics, not carvings. And like it says, they finally created the first large sculpture since the Romans. And here is the exterior of a Romanesque church. So you see your arches, column. Above the doorway here are figures. And if you go up, you see more figures. These are large figures carved. But we still see just Roman arches. We aren't seeing Gothic arches yet. Those don't happen until the Gothic era. And here is the interior of that same church, a continuation of arches and columns. You'll notice it still has the same architectural interior with the nave and side aisles and the apse and altar at the end. And here's a closer look of the carvings above the door there. Eventually, Gothic architectural style is going to overtake Romanesque style. We've talked about the Gothic style in depth already, and most of you already did a lovely essay over it, so you probably know most of this already. But Gothic style is known for its pointed arches, flying buttresses, stained glass windows, and the idea of trying to create a heavenly city or a heavenly feeling within the interior. And of course, the most quintessential Gothic church is the Notre Dame des Chartres, which we've already looked at, which has loads of Gothic arches, flying buttresses, and stained glass windows. Like I said, known for its Gothic style. The rose window or rose de France window in the center illustrates the Old Testament. And of course, the statues below also illustrate the Old Testament, as we learned a few weeks ago. Here's a closer look at that window. And that is it for our rest of chapter 16, which focuses on primarily Christian art. Before we start the Renaissance and Baroque period, are there any questions about Christian or Byzantine art that anyone wants to ask while I'm rechecking attendance? Okay, give me a second, because we had a lot of people log in late today, which is fine. At least they came. Okay. Sorry about that. On to chapter 17 then. So we're going to be covering a few different time periods, not too much of a time lapse though. We're going to be looking at the Renaissance period, the Baroque period, and the Rococo period. The Renaissance period has both a Northern and an Italian Renaissance happening. There's also an early and high Renaissance. Lucky you, you don't have to learn about mannerism, which is late Renaissance. Following the Renaissance period is the Baroque period. The Baroque period is most well known for being ornate and over the top. If you remember, it's like the Hellenistic period was for the Greeks. So Greek art had early archaic Greek art, and then classical, and then Hellenistic. That's pretty much what happens with the Renaissance and the Baroque. The Renaissance is to classical Greece as Baroque is to Hellenistic. So Renaissance is all about trying to make things idealized and three-dimensional. Baroque period is just trying to make things super ornate and over the top and exaggerated, just like the Hellenistic art. Rococo is a particular art trend that was popular in France, and it is all about the fête galante, or the frivolous wastes of time. I speak badly of the Rococo period, but I actually am quite fond of it. But it is a complete waste. But I like it, but it's a waste. That'll make sense when we get to it. So humanism is really important for talking about the Renaissance, because if it wasn't for humanism and the humanists, we wouldn't have had a Renaissance. Humanism is a way of thought that emphasizes the importance of individuality and critical thought. What that means is, at the time, everybody was like a sheep following what the Catholic Church told them to do, and the humanists were like, whoa, read the Bible for yourself and figure out if you actually want to do what they're telling you to do, or if you want to do your own thing. Because of that, there was something called the Reformation, which helped invent a whole lot of other religions like Baptist, Calvinist, Methodist, Puritan, Pilgrim, a blue million different kinds of offshoots of Christianity are formed during that time period. So, like I said, humanism is basically the spark of the Renaissance. Not only are people making their own new versions of Christianity, they're also looking back at Greek and Roman philosophers who also encouraged you to think for yourselves, and started following their advice. So we see a lot of new inventions and new art styles happening, and a rebirth of Greek and Roman artistic trends. Realism, just a reminder, is trying to make things realistic. During the Renaissance, realism is very important for the artists. They're trying to make things realistic. And one of the ways that people start making things realistic is they use foreshortening. Foreshortening is a technique of using diagonal angles to make bodies and objects look more authentic. And of course, still life is a genre or a style of painting in which there are only inanimate objects. Still life paintings really only happen in the Northern Renaissance, and we'll talk about why later. I'll give you guys a few more minutes to write that. Okay, so like I said, before the Renaissance happened, those humanists were encouraging people to start reading things on their own and thinking for themselves. This sparks something called the Reformation, which challenged Roman Catholic religion. The Roman Catholic Church back then is quite different from the Roman Catholic Church today. Back then, early Roman Catholic beliefs said that you had to pay alms for people to pray for your soul to exit purgatory into heaven. Things have changed. You no longer have to pay to get into heaven. Instead, they have other options for you, such as prayer and confession. So it's quite a bit different than it used to be. It used to be that the only way you could really ensure your soul would get out of purgatory and enter heaven was if you had a lot of money. And of course, that did not appeal to poor people. But what it did appeal to them were other religions like baptism and Calvinists that didn't say you had to be rich. Of course, this ends up sparking a change in the Catholic Church as well later on. And that's a whole lot of religious history that you didn't really need to know anything about, but hey, a freebie. So like I said, the humanists help lead to people questioning their own way of thinking. And that idea of questioning things ends up transferring over into the field of art as well. This ends up leading to the Renaissance, which is a rebirth, once again, of Greek and Roman ideas and styles. We're particularly going to be only looking at the art influence of these Greek and Roman styles and ways of thinking. It is important, once again, to keep in mind that there are two Renaissance happening. There is the Italian Renaissance, which is what everyone thinks of when they think of art. And there is the Northern Renaissance that is happening up in Flanders, near like Amsterdam and places like that. And personally, I like the Northern European one better. But that's just me. Most people don't. And like I said, this is the time period when artists are trying to be very realistic with their works again, just like the Greeks and the Romans did. So with the Renaissance, there's an early Renaissance and there's a high Renaissance in Italy. The most famous artists that come out of the high Renaissance are Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Michelangelo. The fourth Ninja Turtle, Donatello, is actually part of the early Renaissance movement in Italy, not the high Renaissance. So I don't know why he got lumped in with them, but he wasn't even alive when they were alive. So yeah. But in the Italian Renaissance, how artists made money is that wealthy families would commission these artists to make artworks for the church. Because once again, back then in the early Roman Catholicism, the more money you had, the more likely you would be going to heaven. So if you gave a lot of money to artists to make artwork for the church, you would probably end up going to heaven. Or at least you could show off how wealthy you were. So most of the art made in the Italian Renaissance was paid for either by the church or by wealthy merchants. One early example of a very early Renaissance artist is Giotto's Scrivini Chapel, which is what we see here. Giotto did a whole bunch of wall frescoes and ceiling frescoes for this Scrivini Chapel. This was a private family-owned chapel, once again from the early Renaissance period. In the early Renaissance period, they still had issues trying to make things realistic. This was once again the very beginning of it. And because they had issues with realism or making things look three-dimensional, we still see some flat two-dimensionality here with Giotto's Crucifixion and Lamentation. So rather than making things shrink in the background or using anything like linear perspective. All that Giotto did to try and add depth to the painting was stack. So stacking objects or figures on top of each other to try and give the illusion of depth. But there's no linear perspective being used here. And this is the most famous image from the Scrovini Chapel. This is the Kiss of Judas. Why is this the most famous one? I don't know, but it is. Now, Masaccio comes a little bit after Giotto in the Renaissance period, and Masaccio is one of the early artists. He's not the first, but he's one of the early artists that starts using linear perspective. If you remember linear perspective, that is when we start using mathematical proportions and lines to make things actually look three-dimensional. So instead of just using stacking here, Masaccio has actually used math proportions and linear perspective to make the people and the objects appear like they are receding in space. And there's quite a bit going on in this simple painting here. It looks quite plain, but there's a lot going on. So in the foreground, you see the husband and wife figures. These are the donors. He is a wealthy merchant, and that's his wife. They have paid for Masaccio to paint this painting, which they in turn donated to the church. Here you see Mary, and I'm pretty sure that's Paul, might be John, one of the saints. And then Christ, the Son, God the Father, and the dove represents the Holy Spirit or Holy Ghost. And see St. John. I couldn't remember if it was Peter or John. It was John. And then below there is a skeleton with the inscription above him, what you are, I once was, what I am, you will be. This is a memento mori. Memento moris become very popular in the Renaissance period, and they're most well known for being used in the Northern Renaissance, but we do get to see some examples of it being used in the Italian Renaissance. Memento mori means remember death. So remember that you're going to die. And it becomes a very popular trend in art for people to have memento moris, which is why there is a skeleton there, just to remind you that you are going to die, so you might want to get right with God. And here is our linear perspective. It is 1-point linear perspective. So all of our lines converge at this one point. And here is your horizon line. And like I said, all of the lines will end up going there. And that is how he figured out the proportions of all of these figures and all of these ceiling tiles and the columns to make them look more realistic. Another example of early Renaissance, this time not a painting, but a sculpture, is Donatello. Like I mentioned, the fourth Ninja Turtle is part of the early Renaissance, and this is what he did. He was a sculptor. This is his David. We're actually going to be looking at 3 different versions of David tonight. This is the first of them. I always like to ask you guys to compare the 3 Davids because they're all very different. This David was done in the early Renaissance. We're going to look at another David created during the High Renaissance. And then our final David was made during the Baroque period. So to start off, what is the first thing you guys notice about this David?
Hat.
What about the hat?
It has florals, it looks like it.
You guys are being way too specific there.
He's naked.
There you go. The only thing he's wearing is a hat. That's what you could have gone with, Brock. He's naked. Is this a young David or an idealized version of David? What's going on with him?
Is it an ideal?
He's ideal. Do you guys agree?
Yes.
Do we remember what our idealized male figures look like from Greek history?
That's a version of him.
Huh?
That's a young version of him.
That's a very young version. That's a teenage version. Our idealized forms are in the mid-20s. Now, speaking of idealized, is this David masculine?
No.
No. Normal idealized figures are masculine. So this is very much not an idealized form. This is a feminine young David, and he is nude. He's only wearing a hat and some boots. Now let's focus on what stage he is in. If we remember the story of David, that's the guy that kills Goliath the giant. Is this David before he's killed Goliath, while he's killing Goliath, or after he's killed Goliath?
Before.
After.
After. He's standing on his head, girl.
Oh, my bad.
His head's down there. And he's carrying the swords too, during and before he was carrying stones. So this one is also made of bronze. Our later Davids will not be made of bronze. This is the only one. This bronze statue was made using the lost wax casting method, if we remember what that is from forever ago. It's a very long, tedious process. And this is quite a large sculpture as well. But that is our first David. Remember what we talked about when we get to the second one. Because this David is a whole lot different from the other Davids. I will let you know that now. Another thing that pops up during the early Renaissance period is the idea of Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism is the thought process that not only do we want to bring back the art styles of Greek and Romans, but we also want to bring back the gods and the goddesses and start using them in artworks and stories again. So Neoplatonism is a rebirth of the gods and goddesses in art. It's the idea that not everything needs to be related to Christianity. Which an example of that being used in artworks is Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus. So this was once again during the early Renaissance period, and it's the first time since ancient Greece and ancient Rome that we've seen an illustration of a mythological figure. Of course, this one is Venus. Now, moving on from early Renaissance to high Renaissance. The high Renaissance is where we get super, super realistic looking artworks. And this is where our big three guys come in at: Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. The high Renaissance occurs roughly between the ages of 1490 and 1530. Of course, that's not like exact. It's not like they woke up that day and said, we're going to start making high Renaissance art today, guys. That's a rough estimation. And it is also roughly estimated that it begins in Florence, Rome, and Venice simultaneously. The first Renaissance artist that we're going to look at is Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci did not consider himself just to be an artist. He also considered himself a scientist and a scholar. So he would often make studies, studies of anatomy, studies of potential flight, studies of a lot of different things. One of his early studies was the fetus in the womb, which we see here. which has a lot of notes and sketches going on it, done in pen and ink. And another early sketch is, of course, this one that's an early example of the possibilities of flight. And the one he's really well known for, the Vitruvian Man. But here is a painting that he's probably most well known for, the Mona Lisa, which is surprisingly small. And if you want to see it, you're going to have to wait in line for hours. And it's only famous because it was stolen and then returned. And it made the news quite a bit. Because it made a lot of tabloid news, people all of a sudden wanted to go see it, and it became super famous. And now there's a whole bunch of movies about it, and yada, yada, yada. But it does have very nice, light, feathery brushstrokes going on. He has used atmospheric perspective here. Just a reminder, atmospheric perspective is when you make the background look hazy to create the appearance of depth and distance in a landscape. And of course, nobody really is for sure who this is. Most people think it is a merchant's daughter, but there's a lot of speculation about who she is exactly. And here we have Da Vinci's Last Supper. This one's a little bit more interesting to me because of the medium that he used. He decided to make his own version of a fresco secco. Normally, fresco secco would use a tempera paint. He decided that he wasn't going to use tempera paint. He was going to try and make his own concoction of a paint and apply it to a dry plaster and hope for the best. He thought it worked, but it didn't. It started deteriorating immediately. If you're wondering what this little alcove here is, that's the doorway to the cafeteria. The doorway didn't originally go through the painting. It was added later. This Last Supper is located in a cafeteria of a church where the monks would live and eat. A lot of Last Supper paintings are done in cafeterias for the monks to enjoy. But here you see the illustration of that particular biblical story with Christ in the center. He creates a lovely triangle, and we have groupings of 3 figures on all sides. Well, this one's only 2, and 3 here, and lovely swirling patterns, and all of the swirling patterns end up taking you, of course, to him. In fact, there's also linear perspective being used, and he is the focal point of the linear perspective as well. Actually, it's right above him right here. But yeah, the paint that he used started flaking off immediately, so this thing's always under constant conservation to try and preserve it. And if you're wondering what these things are on the walls, they're tapestries. I know the first time I saw this, I was wondering what those were. And there is our linear perspective. And here's our second David from Michelangelo. Once again, we are now in the High Renaissance. The last one was from the early Renaissance. This particular David is done by Michelangelo. It was done for the city of Florence. David was actually, like, I would want to say, a patron saint almost, or a representative biblical figure for the city of Florence. Florence was a very small city-state in Italy, and it was surrounded by very large, wealthy city-states. David was a small boy who fought off a giant. Florence likes to think of itself in relation to David and Goliath, and David conquering the giants. So this David and the next David we're going to look at were both made for the city of Florence. This one's very large. It was made for the town square, so it was originally outside. Now there's a plaster copy outside, and this one's inside the museum that's adjacent to that town square. So what do we notice first off with this David?
The ideal version of male.
Yeah, this is our idealized male. So this one's in his mid-20s. He's more muscular built. He's not as feminine as the last one. He's also got a lot of the rebirth of Greek and Roman ideas. If you remember, it's the Greeks that invent contrapposto. Here we see a great example of contrapposto being used. Contrapposto, just a reminder, is when you're not super stiff. The other David wasn't stiff either, but this one's a very obvious example of contrapposto being used. What else do you guys notice?
He has like a rag or something over his shoulder.
Yeah, that's not a rag, that's a slingshot, but you're on a good track there.
Okay.
So speaking of a slingshot, what step is he in the killing of Goliath?
Preparation mode.
Preparation, yes. So here he has a slingshot over his shoulder. He's looking off into the distance, sizing up Goliath, and actually in this hand he has some stones. So he is getting ready. He's preparing. The last thing that we need to talk about with this David is what he's made of. The last David was made of bronze. What's this one made of?
Marble.
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 What other people group have we talked about that are really well known for using marble?
Greeks.
The Greeks and the Romans, well, particularly the Romans. The Romans made marble copies of the Greek statues. If you remember, all of those Roman copies had a stupid little rock or a stump attached to them. That was because they needed them for support, just a refresher there. So Michelangelo literally even copied the dumb little stump that the Romans did in their marble copies here. So this looks, if you stuck this back in ancient Roman times, it would fit right in. It is literally an exact copy of what they did. Another thing that Michelangelo is really well known for is the paintings in the Sistine Chapel, particularly the ceiling paintings and the Last Judgment painting on the wall. So Michelangelo himself hated painting. He only did it when he was forced to do so by the Pope. It was the Pope that required him to do the ceiling and the wall here. Michelangelo only liked to sculpt. He hated painting, but he was pretty good at painting. The most well-known image from the ceiling is, of course, this one, the creation of Adam, which is a very illustrative version of a biblical story that didn't actually happen. This is not how it goes in the Bible, but hey, Michelangelo took some artistic credit there. This is God surrounded by cupids and angels, giving birth to Adam over here. Of course, once again, Adam is a very idealized male form, echoing those Greek and Roman ideas. And this particular painting always interests me a lot more than the ceiling. This is the Last Judgment that's located at the front here. The reason why this one always interests me a little bit more is because there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of interesting stories too. So here we see an illustration of heaven, purgatory, and hell. So down in the bottom corner here, you see the river Styx. The demon is transporting people across the river Styx to hell in the bottom corner. And here you see demons trying to pull people down from purgatory into the realm of hell. And then right above purgatory, you see heaven. You see some saints pulling people out of purgatory into heaven too, but not near as many. And of course, in heaven, like I said, it's a bunch of saints. Every single saint in this painting is paired with whatever it was that killed them, so that you know who's who. It's like the who's who of heaven. In the center here, we see God with Mary right next to him. If you are super, super familiar with all of your saints, which I am not super familiar with my saints, I used to be better at it, but now I'm not. Up here you see the saint that was known for being crushed by a column. There is one of the 12 apostles that was crucified upside down. I can't remember which one is which. There is a saint, I'm trying to look for them all, the cool ones anyways. This saint here, he was grilled to death, so he's holding his grill right there. And then the last one we'll look at is this one. This dude right here, he was skinned alive, so he is holding his skin. In his skin, fun fact, is a self-portrait by Michelangelo. So like I said, if you really know all your saints, you can probably figure out who's who in all of this image. But there's a lot going on. And that's why I think it's a little bit more interesting than the ceiling too. And our last of the big three is Raphael. We've already kind of looked at this painting before by Raphael. Raphael ended up dying young in his 20s. Michelangelo and Da Vinci lived to be very old. Michelangelo lived into, I'm pretty sure, his 60s. Raphael did, it was like 22, 23 when he died. That's because Raphael liked to drink, party, and have a lot of sex. So he died very young. Most people think that it's probably either drinking too much or a venereal disease. So yeah, Raphael is actually buried in the Pantheon that we looked at last week. But because he died young, we don't have too many works from him. Most art historians feel like had he lived longer, he probably would have been a lot more well known than Da Vinci or Michelangelo, because the works he produced were on par with their works from when they were in their 40s, and he was in his early 20s. Here's an example of one of his frescoes, the School of Athens, which of course the focal point of the School of Athens is Aristotle and Plato. School of Athens is a celebration of the Greek and Roman philosophies and the idea of education and thinking for oneself. It is a wonderful example of linear perspective. The focal point is right here, and your horizon line is right there, and all of your lines go towards them. And of course, here is a self-portrait of Raphael back here, and Michelangelo's up here with his stone, and Da Vinci's right here. And you probably pick out everyone in this painting, but yeah. Here's another example of a work by Raphael. This is a watercolor on paper. The fact that he was able to create something this detailed and realistic with watercolor is extremely impressive. If you've ever tried to use watercolors, you would probably realize that. We have some atmospheric perspective being used here. There's also linear perspective happening. And this is a biblical story of Paul, or Saint Paul, which is why he has a little halo there, preaching to the city of Athens. Like I said, there are two Renaissance. There's the Italian Renaissance, and then there is the Northern European Renaissance. We are now going to take a brief detour to the Northern Renaissance. Northern Renaissance, once again, happens in Flanders or in areas around places like Amsterdam. We're talking about like Norway, Scandinavia area. And in the Northern Renaissance, they are primarily using oil paint. They're, in fact, the first people to use oil paints, Jan van Eyck being the very first person. Oil paints allow you to get a lot more depth and detail with your painting, so it makes things look a lot more realistic. And the Renaissance is all about realism, so it works out great. Jan van Eyck is probably most well known for the Arnolfini portrait, which we've already talked about before. It has a lot of symbolism that indicates fidelity, fertility, marriage, possibly a business transaction. There's a lot of questions about this particular piece. It used to be called the wedding portrait. Now it is not, because most people don't think it's a wedding anymore. But we see a depiction of very realistic figures in a realistic setting. He did such a great job with his fine brush strokes that you can tell the different textures of the fabrics. You can tell that this is a fur cloak. You can see the dog's fur, the wood grain on the floor, the metallic chandelier in the back, the reflection on the mirror. This is all thanks to oil and a very, very detailed brush stroke. So this took a lot of time. And just a reminder of how detailed he was. He copied the image in the mirror. Back here, you see the couple's backs. Jan van Eyck is right here. And you actually see the story of the Lamentation of Christ happening in the rondels. These rondels were done with a brush that had a single brush hair on it. The Lamentation of Christ is just the story of Christ's crucifixion. You can even see the fine detailed beadswork and the little tassels. And of course, above it, it says Jan van Eyck was here and the date it was painted, which is why they think that it might have been a business transaction, because he had to witness something. And here, there's a lot of symbols that he's doing or leaving his wife something. So that's most art historians believe today. And there's a lot of fertility symbols to make people realize that that is husband and wife. She is not pregnant. That is just the fashion of the day. Everyone always thinks she's pregnant. That's just the fashion from the time period. And here's another example of a Northern Renaissance artwork. This is by the artist Hans Holbein. The title of this piece is The Ambassadors. And this is actually a memento mori. Just a reminder, a memento mori is a reminder that you're gonna die. Does anyone see why this would be a memento mori? No one can tell why this might be a reminder of death.
That looks kind of like a skull, like in
Yeah. So this is a cool painting because it looks like something was digitally printed and stretched out on this canvas. There's actually a skull down here, but this was painted back in the early Renaissance, well, high Renaissance for the Northern period. So back in the 1500s, early 1500s. So it's quite impressive that Hans Holbein was able to accurately stretch out a skull across the bottom just to add in your reminder of death. Memento moris were once again extremely, extremely popular in the Northern European Renaissance. That's because the Puritans and Pilgrims were very prevalent there, and they were all about reminding people that they were going to die. And it's going to be quite a theme going forward. This is called The Ambassadors, but it's actually an illustration of these two guys that are about to go and explore the New World, which is why you see a bunch of globes here, some mapping tools to help you map the stars. A little example of foreshortening is down here with the musical instrument. Once again, foreshortening is using a diagonal to try and make things look more realistic. And this was painted right after Columbus. And here is a self-portrait of Hans Holbein himself. I like to throw that in because he looked like Jesus, which is funny because I originally, when I first saw this, thought it was Jesus. That was a long time ago. Now I know it's a self-portrait. But here's another great example of an artist that was able to use fine details to capture different textures in painting. And once again, that's mostly thanks to oil paint. Hans Holbein is also very well known for his printmaking abilities. We've already looked at this one before with the printmaking section, but here you see the very detailed etching. This is an intaglio print, which was on metal plate. Now, back to the Italian Renaissance. During the late Italian Renaissance, architects start picking up on the idea of reinvigorating architecture with Roman and Greek styles. So we see a departure from the Gothic trend, and they end up going back to using a lot of Greek and Roman influence. And we see that very strongly with Andrea Palladio and his Villa Rotunda. Palladio became so well known for this Roman style of architecture that he actually wrote a ton of books about it. And those books are going to come up next week in our lecture. So they're going to be important for you to remember that he became a best-selling author. He's more well known probably for his books than his architecture at this point, I think. But we're going to see a rebirth of the dome, the pediment, the frieze, and columns, as well as arches. So this building is a house on top of a hill. The merchant that hired Palladio to create it wanted it for his retirement. It's on the top of the tallest hill on his property. He wanted to be able to host parties there and show off his land. Every single side of this building is identical. It's a perfect square, and it's pretty much just to show off property. The only purpose that the guy hired Palladio to make it. But it's because of Palladio that we're going to see something called the Federalist style later, which becomes popular in America. And our very last Italian Renaissance piece, this was done towards the end of the High Renaissance by an artist named Paolo Veronese. This is The Feast in the House of Levi. The original title of this work, though, was The Last Supper. Veronese got in a lot of trouble for this painting. He even got questioned by the Spanish Inquisition because of this painting. So, yeah, like I said, it was originally titled The Last Supper. The Last Supper is a very somber biblical story with Christ before he announces that he's going to be betrayed and be crucified. But if you notice, Christ is in the center here, and he's surrounded by a bunch of people drinking and partying. These people are not in early Christian clothing. They are in Renaissance period clothing because that's the time period this was painted. That's not normal. If you've noticed, as we've gone through this particular section so far, if people have had clothes on, they have been wearing Roman and Greek clothing or ancient clothing. These guys are wearing what would have been in 1573 contemporary style. So that's strike number one for Veronese on why he got in trouble with this one. Strike number two is the fact that, once again, the Last Supper is supposed to be a somber theme in the Bible, but these guys are all drunk and partying. That was the big one that got him in trouble. The church that he painted this for required him to repaint it and make it a proper Last Supper. Veronese refused to do that, which was strike three for him, and why he ended up being questioned by the Inquisition. But instead of repainting it, he did retitle it The Feast in the House of Levi. And if you're familiar with your Bible stories, you'll know that was the particular wedding party in which Christ turned the water into wine. So it makes sense that there's a bunch of people drinking. But you also see some lovely Greek and Roman architectural features happening here. And that is a great segue into what happens next in Italy, which is the Baroque period. The Baroque period is known for extravagance and a lot of theatrics, which you can already see beginning to happen in this painting here. So once again, the Baroque period is known for drama, emotion, splendor, and a lot of ornate architecture. They use extreme lights and darks, also known as chiaroscuro. And it is a product of the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation was an attempt by the Catholic Church to get people to come back. So we see very, very dramatic storytelling of religious biblical themes to try and convince people to come back to the church. Our first example of a Baroque artist is Caravaggio. Caravaggio is most well known for his chiaroscuro. He is one of the first artists to use chiaroscuro, which once again is extreme lights and darks. Of course, you can see like it basically looks like St. Paul here, who is the main character in the story, has a spotlight on him. That's how chiaroscuro works. It's like you have a theatrical spotlight on you that makes everything in the background look black. If you're familiar with your story of St. Paul, he used to be called Saul, and he used to hunt down Christians, and then Christ blinded him, and he ends up converting to Christianity and changing his name to Paul. And right here is the moment in the story where God has blinded him, and he fell off of his horse. This is also a wonderful example of foreshortening. So you can tell that Paul has a whole body here, but the way that Caravaggio has set up this diagonal composition, he has foreshortened it. So it looks like the body is receding back into the painting, even though the painting is actually flat. So it makes things a lot more realistic in appearance. Here is another Caravaggio. This is Judith beheading Holofernes. I put this one in here because there's another Judith beheading Holofernes that we're going to look at right afterwards. But here you see once again your extreme lights and darks. I'm going to try and shrink it so it's not as blurry. Of course, the spotlight is on this leading lady right here. This is Judith. This is another biblical story. However, this one is not in our Bible today. Fun fact, there are some Bible stories that are no longer in our Bible today, and this is one of them. So the story of Judith is one in which Judith saves the Jewish people from the Assyrians who have conquered them. So Holofernes is the Assyrian general. He has just captured a large Jewish city. Judith was not going to put up with him conquering the Jewish people, so she seduced Holofernes, and he took her to his tent, and she cut off his head. And she put his head on a spike, and that scared away all of the other Assyrian forces, and the Jewish people were free. And here is that story illustrated here. Does this Judith look like she's super eager to cut off his head?
No.
No, she looks like me when my cat pukes and I have to clean it up. Like I'm gonna do it, but I don't want to. There's also not too much blood coming out here. I mean, it looks like there's a lot of blood, but in comparison to the next one that we're going to look at, there's not much blood. The maidservant also doesn't look like she's too into it. She's just like there as a witness. And he's not really fighting back too much, even though he's getting his head chopped off. This is going to be compared to this Judith beheading Holofernes. Same story, same moment in time. This is also the scene in which Judith is cutting off Holofernes' head. What is different about this one?
She looks more aggressive in this one.
Yeah. So she is definitely more aggressive. The maidservant is no longer just a witness. She is helping out. There's a lot more blood. Holofernes is trying to fight back in this one. It's a lot more gruesome. I like to point that out because this one's done by a woman and the last one was done by a man, which might be why there's a difference. Also, Artemisia Gentileschi did not have a great history with men. Her mentor, who was another famous artist at the time, accused her of some crimes and she didn't actually commit them. He just wanted to cover up something. So she ended up being tortured for crimes that she didn't actually commit because of her mentor. And she kind of took out those frustrations in her painting. She has a really interesting story, and I like to talk about her a little bit because it's not often in Renaissance period that we got to talk about females, because it kind of wasn't allowed for females to be artists. And that brings us to our very last David. This one is done by an artist named Bernini. This is, of course, during the Baroque period. So we've looked at a David that had already killed Goliath in the early Renaissance, a David from the High Renaissance that was preparing to kill Goliath. And what do we think about this David?
Looks like an older version of him.
Yeah, this is the oldest version of David here, for sure. What else do we notice?
His pose is different.
Yeah, his pose is a lot more dynamic in this one. There's movement and action, whereas the last two Davids were kind of just posing. That's because during the Baroque period, they liked to be a lot more theatrical. And it's also because he is in the action of shooting his slingshot. So we talked about the David that was preparing and the David that had already killed. This one is in the process of shooting his slingshot. What else do we notice about the David?
He's wearing clothes.
Yeah, he's wearing clothes. That's the big one. He's wearing clothes. Another thing I'd like to point out is his facial expression. The other two Davids didn't have too much going on with their facial emotion. This one does. He's a lot more intense here because, once again, it's the Baroque period and they're very much invested in emotions. He does still, however, have a little stump attached to him. Here's another Bernini sculpture. This is the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. Saint Teresa was a saint that believed she could hear God's voice. And one night, she had a dream that God came down and pierced her heart with his light. And that is what we see illustrated here. There is an angel holding a little golden arrow, and Saint Teresa is in ecstasy as that light is about to penetrate her heart. If we got a really good close-up on it, you would see her facial expression as well as the angels. We see, once again, movement and action taking place here. They aren't just posing. We even see exaggeration going on with particularly Saint Teresa here. I can't show this one in my morning classes because they don't take it seriously. But you guys, I can't see you, so I don't really care. Here is what's happening in the northern area during the Baroque period. In the north, we have Peter Paul Rubens, who is a court painter for the King of England at the time. If you ever go to England, there are a ton of Peter Paul Rubens paintings. That's because the dude had to make a lot of money because he had a lot of kids. He had 13 kids. So there are a ton of Peter Paul Rubens paintings because he had to sell a lot of paintings to make a lot of money to pay for 13 children. He also liked to live a very lavish lifestyle. I say that because we're going to be looking at quite a few different Peter Paul Rubens in a second. But here is the triptych, the raising of the cross. Triptych means a painting done in 3 parts. Did we look at this one already in this class? I can't remember. I take that as a no. Because my morning class, we had studied this one in depth. So I couldn't remember if we did in here. Here in the center part, we see Christ being risen on the cross. Of course, a very exaggerated pose here. These men are extremely muscular to illustrate the strenuous effort put into the raising of the cross. There is a directional force line that leads us up to his face. And of course, there's figures surrounding him, raising him. I like to look a little bit at the facial expressions. I might actually blow this up a bit so that we can get a closer look at the faces. Possibly, if I can. Should have just blown up the slide. But here we see this man in the back wearing the silver armor. Does he look like he is super enthusiastic about this process?
No.
No. I always think he looks like concerned or worried.
Yeah.
Yeah. That might have to do with what's going on up in the sky here, which we'll talk about in a second. But the interesting thing is here, we see the face of a man who is looking directly at us. That's not normal for this time period of painting. That never happens. It's very rare when the artist paints a viewer looking directly at you. The other interesting figure that occurs here is this man here with the bald head. What do you guys think about him? What does he look like to you? Does he look human?
Yes.
He looks human? I mean, his body does. There's something going on up here.
His ears are different.
His ears.
His ears
It's
are
a demon.
He's a demon, yes. So this is a reference to an earlier study done by Peter Paul Rubens for a similar painting, which had a demon illustrated here with the raising of the cross. Over on this panel, we see the women weeping as Christ is being raised, and of course, St. John and Christ's mother Mary. Mary here is illustrated a little bit differently. During the Counter-Reformation, instead of showing Mary as a weak woman, they wanted to show her as a strong, resolute, faithful woman. So she is not shown crying. She is supposed to be an example for the other women to look at in that time period as being strong and faithful. Because once again, we're in the Counter-Reformation era. And over here on this side, we see the Roman guards in the process of crucifying the two criminals. If you're familiar with that story, there's two criminals that get crucified with Christ. And of course, in the Bible, there is the setting of when Christ is crucified, there is an eclipse and an earthquake, which is what is happening up here. Which is why I said that might be why he's a little bit concerned, because he's kind of looking over there. You might be wondering, why is there what? Because they didn't know what an eclipse was back then. But yeah, so that's an interesting painting. There's a whole lot going on in there. There's a lot more than what I even talked about. The composition choices actually make an S, starting with the dog down here. That's because our eyes like to follow curvy things. So it kind of helps lead our eyes around the painting. There's a lot more stuff going on than just that, though. Here's another Peter Paul Rubens. This is Daniel in the Lion's Den. Once again, showing you a lot of drama and exaggeration. I mean, even the lion's faces have a lot of exaggeration happening here. And here is a self-portrait of Peter Paul Rubens and his wonderful wife. And the very final Peter Paul Rubens that we're going to look at here. This is an illustration of a mythological story. This is entitled The Judgment of Paris. This is a fun one, though. Is anyone familiar with The Judgment of Paris and that story from mythology? It's an interesting story. So, as the story goes, the three goddesses, Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera, one day went to Zeus and asked him which one was the prettiest. And Zeus was not stupid, so he did not answer. And he said, you know what? I heard about this guy named Paris down on Earth, and he's supposed to be a super fair judge. You should go and ask him. So the lovely goddesses went to Earth and asked Paris which one he thought was the prettiest. He was like, I can't really tell. So they decided to start stripping naked to try and convince him which one was the prettiest. And he said, I still can't really tell. So then they decided to bribe him. Hera, I can't remember what she offered him, something about providence in the future. Athena offered wisdom in battle, in all of his future battles. Paris was a prince, the Prince of Troy, so he would have needed that. And Aphrodite offered him the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife. Paris, being Paris, chose Aphrodite. He said Aphrodite was the prettiest woman in the world. And as promised, Aphrodite granted him Helen, who was already married to the king of Sparta at the time, as his wife. And this ends up starting the Trojan War, which is where that wooden horse comes into play. This is where it all started, which is a fun little story. Over in Spain, the Baroque period takes a different spin with the work of the court painter Diego Velázquez, who is painted right here. That is his self-portrait. This is his most well-known painting, Las Meninas. And just like in Peter Paul Rubens' works, there's a lot going on in this one too. So we already see there's a self-portrait of Velázquez here. He is painting something on this large canvas here. What is he painting? Well, if we look at the mirror in the background, we can tell he is painting the King and Queen of Spain. But the painting itself is actually a painting of the Princess of Spain surrounded by her court. So there's a painting within a painting here, which is why it's a little fun. And of course, we can't move on from the Baroque period in Northern Europe without focusing a little bit on Rembrandt. This is Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son. You might notice Rembrandt's works are a bit different from Rubens or Velázquez pieces in the sense that Rembrandt chooses to use a lot more of a light, feathery brush stroke in his paintings. And here's a self-portrait of Rembrandt. He did a lot of self-portraits. He would do one every year, like a school photo. And he is most well known for this painting, The Night Watch, which is also like a school photo, but like a class photo. So in Amsterdam, at the period of time that we're talking about right now, the Baroque period, it was quite popular for guilds to paint pictures together, so get a picture taken together kind of thing. So this is what I would call class portrait of one of the guilds in Amsterdam at the time. But this is a very different class portrait than a normal class portrait. Most of these guild portraits, they would just be standing together like your elementary school kids would in their class photos. This one, however, has a lot happening, which is rare. So Rembrandt has chosen to paint these men in action rather than just standing still. They're all holding weapons. This particular guild was known for their rifle. They were riflemen, which is why this man here is holding a rifle. He's in the process of lighting the rifle. This one is in the process of priming it. And then there is a man in the background here that's in the process of shooting it. So we have all of the different stages of using this gun illustrated here. In fact, it was copied out of a manual. These men, though, are not on the way to fight a battle. They are getting ready for a parade. There were no battles to be fought in this time period, so this guild just existed for pleasure. And like I said, they're in the process of getting ready for a parade. This is the guild leader and his lieutenant right here. And at the time, you would be able to actually know who's who in this painting because it was, like I said, a class photo. And the interesting thing in the background is, of course, this glowing little girl. She is, most people think, just there to represent the guild itself because she has a dead chicken tied to her waist, and this particular guild was represented by chicken feet. That was their emblem. A fun little story there. And our other example of Northern Baroque period art is Jan Vermeer. Vermeer is well known for his simple indoor setting paintings, but he's also a wonderful example of Puritan style artwork that was being created in the time period. Puritans were not supposed to illustrate their wealth outright. So you wouldn't see them donating things to churches like in Italy. In the North, they found subtle ways to illustrate how wealthy they were. This painting at first glance does not look like it is showing off the wealth of a person. However, it is very much doing that. So it looks like a maid is just pouring milk like she's getting ready for breakfast in the kitchen, which of course wouldn't show wealth at all. But this painting has a ton of blue used in it. Blue of this quality is made using the stone lapis lazuli and grinding it up. Lapis lazuli is a precious stone, and it was quite rare at the time and expensive. So if you could afford to pay your artist to use a blue this rich in color, you must have been very wealthy. They even used it on the tile in the background. So Vermeer is very well known for doing these very simplistic looking paintings that hint at wealth. Here's another Vermeer painting, once again using that same blue. The other fun thing about Vermeer paintings is that they're usually in a corner setting, in an interior. It's pretty easy to pick out Vermeer. And here's another Vermeer, once again in a corner using blue. And the painting that Vermeer is most well known for is Girl with the Pearl Earring, mostly because there's a lot of mystery surrounding it. This is also quite different from Vermeer's other paintings, and it was not commissioned by a merchant or family. It was done solely because Vermeer wanted to do it, which is also why there's a lot of mystery surrounding it. You see the solid black background, which is quite different from the other Vermeers we've been looking at, and all focus is put on this girl, which no one is for sure who it is. And that takes us to the main type of painting that was done in Northern Europe during the Baroque period, and those are still life paintings. This is another great example of them subtly putting in how wealthy they were in their paintings. At first glance, this painting does not look like it is showing off substantial amounts of wealth. However, that is the exact purpose of this painting. You can easily see that with the different kinds of flowers used, particularly these tulips. Those tulips today, a single tulip would cost you several $1,000s. So there are quite a few of those there. These are extremely rare, even now, to find. They're only in Holland. They had to import these if they wanted to use them. And like I said, today they're several $1,000s. Back then they were also very expensive. In fact, all of these flowers used in this bouquet would have been imported and cost quite a bit of money. So this painting here literally just shows off wealth. It is also a memento mori, though. You'll notice quite a few of these flowers are wilting, just reminding us that we are all going to die and life is fleeting. Here is another example of them trying to show off their wealth. Of course, this one's a little bit different. We see a lot of fancy tableware here, crabs and oranges. Oranges are a citrus fruit that would have been imported from Italy. Crabs also were very expensive and imported. Same with grapes. And this one is a great example of a memento mori still life that would have been found and quite common in Northern Europe during the Baroque period. You're noticing a theme with Northern Europe paintings now. These are all primarily commissioned by Puritans. And you'll notice there's no people in them. And another still life painting. This one shows off the import of the Persian rug in particular, as well as the citrus and the fancy tableware. And that takes us to our lovely King Louis in France. King Louis also liked to show off his wealth. He showed off his wealth by moving the capital of France from Paris to Versailles and had the Versailles Palace built. We've already talked about this one before. It's a large palace. This is the Hall of Mirrors. It's all about opulence and showing off wealth. Of course, all of this is reproduction during the French Revolution, when Louis XVI, his great-grandson, was beheaded. All of this was stolen. So this is all about opulence. And that takes us to the Rococo period. The Rococo period occurs when Louis XVI is king in France. And it is a continuation of that idea of opulence. It is given the title Fête Galante by the art critics at the time. Fête Galante is not a kind term. It refers to, it basically translates to fat cat or lazy. It's a decorative style, so it's seen a lot in decor. It's seen right here being used in decor. You see a lot of pastels and gold being used. Rococo art is very well known for the usage of golds and pastel colors as well as florals. It's very frivolous, and the main themes in Rococo art are romance, courtship, music, and romance, and romance, and romance. And the most well-known Rococo artists are Watteau, Boucher, and Fragonard. So I mentioned the Rococo period happens when Louis XVI is King of France. What ends up happening to Louis XVI?
Chopped head.
He had his head cut off. His wife is Marie Antoinette. She also had her head cut off. That is because the masses of France were starving to death, and the wealthy were just getting wealthier and partying. And the Rococo period of art is a great example of the wastefulness that came out of the wealthy masses at that time. Here is Watteau's Embarcation for Cythera. This is the reason why Rococo art is given the title Fête Galante, this painting right here. The island of Cythera is an imaginary island where people would go for love. It's like Aphrodite's love island, basically. So you see here all of these couples lined up to get on the boat to head towards Cythera. There's a bunch of cupids flying around. There's a statue of Aphrodite and Cupid here. This is all about romance happening in a period when people are starving. So quite two polar opposites happening in France at that period of time. And like I said at the beginning, I talk badly about Rococo art, but I actually find it quite enjoyable to look at. And here is Fragonard's Happy Accidents of the Swing. This one's a fun one, also about romance and courtship, but this one's a bit cheeky. So here we see this lady on a swing. There is a man down here hiding in the bushes. Another man is back here actually pushing the swing, and there's a statue of a Cupid going shh with his finger. So this poor schmuck back here has been tricked into pushing this lady's swing. He thinks that she likes him. However, little does he know that her lover is hiding in the rose bushes below, peeking up her skirt. And of course, she is tossing her shoe to him. So there's a lovely little love triangle happening here. We see great usage of atmospheric perspective in this painting. There's a lot of action happening. There's still a lot of detail happening, specifically with the foliage and the different textile fabrics. So we see a continuation of the ideas in Renaissance and Baroque art with Rococo art. Just a very different theme is used in Rococo art. It's very frivolous. And of course, our last example of Rococo art, we couldn't leave out the last Rococo artist, Boucher. This is just another example of a lovely, happy, romantic couple lounging together. Of course, she's picked roses, which are romantic, and they're in a garden, which is also romantic and private, and yada, yada, yada. So that's Rococo art. Of course, we all know how that ends for the wealthy people in France afterwards, but it is a fun one. And that actually takes us to the end tonight. I knew if I didn't take a break that we'd probably end close to 7 o'clock. And I was right. So once again, You guys need to do that discussion post, which was over chapter 16. So if you don't remember what we went over in chapter 16, you're going to have to look back at that lesson. That discussion post is due on Sunday. Please do not forget it. Most of you cannot afford to be forgetting it. You have an hour's worth of time now to do it. I would recommend you doing it if you haven't. You also need to be, you need to be working on your individual presentations. Next week, we are going to be spending time working on them. So make sure to come on time next week so that we can get that done. If there are any questions that you need to ask, I will be sticking around on here for a little while to answer those. Otherwise, please stay warm, stay safe, and I will see you guys next week. Have a wonderful rest of your week, guys.
Thank you, Miss.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miss McBride. Have a good week.
Bye, guys.
Have a good week.
You too.
Bye.
Stay warm.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miss, and I'm sorry for being late. I was doing breathing treatment to my child. He got bronchitis, so I'm sorry.
Oh, it's fine. It's totally fine. I always get you, so it's not a big deal.
Thank you, ma'am. See you next week.